Go ahead and continue sharing.
Yes, okay, you're good.
All right, excellent. Let me go ahead and screen share again and we'll get going with land and water use. Okay. I think Tragedy of the Commons is one of the kind of starting points for AP Environmental Science. And so this is the beginning of an FRQ as well. So if you could just post in chat, what is the concept of Tragedy of the Commons? And feel free to be succinct with your answer. Okay, I didn't see many in chat and I may have just kind of didn't give you enough time to post there. Yes, there's one. If one takes too much of a resource without letting it replenish, then the supply will dwindle. Open shared resources will always be depleted in a disastrous way. I like the next one too. Free community resource tends to be overused until it is depleted. So that's one of the main concepts when you think about Tragedy of the Commons. It is a shared limited resource that becomes depleted because people are acting from a self-interest in order for to achieve a short-term gain. And I always think about this picture, which is probably common to a lot of textbooks, that talks about, you know, this green commons that we share in a community. And, you know, a few of us start putting sheep or cows on that land. And then other people in the community think, well, you know, that green space is mine too. I'm going to go ahead and also add some sheep or cows to that environment. And then as we all think, you know, about adding more to increase our personal profit, we end up degrading that environment. So when you think about Tragedy of the Commons, forests, there could be multiple environments, but forests are one thing to consider as a tragedy of the common. And so what is one potential approach? And again, remember they're using the word describe. What is one potential approach to reducing the occurrence of tragedy of the commons in forests? So take a moment to think about that and respond in the chat if you would. One potential approach to reducing the occurrence of tragedy of the commons in forests. I'm seeing logging regulations, restrictions or laws. Okay, definitely a good approach. Legislation, or is there anything else besides legislation that we could do? That's definitely a good one. Plant more trees? Sure, try and be a better steward. Legislation is at the top of the list, you'll notice. The second is privatization. So I would argue that those are the two main things we can do to try and reduce the issues with tragedy of the commons, is we can legislate, you know, to try and regulate how that land is used. Maybe we even create quotas for removal. Replanting requirements, which some of you guys said, to replace the trees that are lost, but then privatization. And that's one of the Nature Conservancy, if you're familiar with that group, that's one of the things that they do is that they buy up land in order to control how it's used. Okay, another main concept in this unit is pests. And so when we think about pests, why are they considered pests? What makes them a pest? That cause harm? That's good. Can you think of one specific way they cause harm? And actually, there's probably lots of different ways, but and you might consider we can have pests agriculturally, we can have pests in our home. Good. So damaging crops, causing disease. Yes. Any other things that they do? Direct conflict with human health. That's good. When they damage environmental functions or life norms, that's great. And damage to food. So with free response questions, sometimes the key is to be as specific as you can, and you guys got there. So they're competing with humans for food. They're invading lawns and gardens. They destroy wood in our houses. Obviously, thinking about termites in this one. They spread disease. And again, you might think of some specific examples like mosquitoes, and they could be a nuisance. So mosquitoes are a nuisance when they bite us, but they're also, possible spreaders of things like malaria. So thinking about free response question, and this was kind of all part of the same one. Identify a negative effect of increasing pest populations in forests or agricultural areas. And so, I mean, we've kind of done that with that last list of all the ways that they could become pests. And you guys did a good job in the chat of coming up with some examples. So crop damage, either because they're feeding on leaves or flowers, or they're laying their eggs in leaves and flowers. They're decreasing crop yield from feeding on the leaves. They may decrease our timber harvest from feeding on trees, or decrease the quality of the timber harvest due to just damage from the pests. I'm thinking about the emerald ash borer and the damage that it does to timber. Nicely done, guys. Okay. Another important part to free response questions, and I picked one specifically from our topic today, is being able to interpret graphs. And I would argue that when you're given a graph, just take a look at it before the questions. Notice I haven't posted those quite yet, and see what kinds of things you observe. And if you want to throw in the chat, what are some patterns that you see? And you might want to make some associations between the two graphs. You notice there's forest disturbance, and we've got beetles, caterpillars, leaf spots, and stem rust fungi. And then we've also got this temperature graph. So there may be some relationships there that we can make. Okay, I'm seeing a couple things come up in chat. The temperature often seems to increase beetle and caterpillar populations, which leads to higher disturbance. That's good. So looking at how these changes in temperature might be associated with a greater population of beetle and caterpillars. Let's look at the question they've got for us on the next ones. Identify the year when leaf spots were found in the highest percent of the surveyed area. What year were leaf spots found in the highest percentage of the surveyed area? Any guesses? Throw those in chat if you would. Yes, Ariella, nice job, 2005. So that's when we see more of the leaf spots, which are the little, represented by the little dark dot. No worries, Zoe. Okay, next question, describe the trend for the occurrence of caterpillars in forests in western Montana from 2010 to 2013. The trend for the occurrence of caterpillars. So is it going up? Is it going down? Is it doing a little bit of both? And be specific about those times. Caterpillars are our little triangle. And we're focusing on 2010 to 2013. So is it staying the same? Is it increasing? Okay, I see a few things in chat. The population, so I see rose quickly and then declined quickly. A major spike and decrease from 2010 to 2013, and then looks like some sort of an overshoot or die off. Good. So I like those vocabularies from our last minute on population. So the percent area increases from 2010 to 2011. So we see an increase of our caterpillar population, and then we follow those little dark triangles and we see them start to decrease from 2011 to 2013. So notice this is not asking us for new information. It's just asking us to interpret the graph. So that's a good skill that we want to make sure we have for FRQs. Okay, another question about these graphs. Yes, thank you. Ms. Campbell just pointed out, notice they want the exact years. And so it's really important, again, for us to be specific. That's an important thing for our FRQs. Okay, this question, explain what the data in both graphs imply about the relationship between temperature and beetle survival. Explain what the data in both graphs imply about the relationship between temperature and beetle survival. Sorry, I think I've left off that word, survival. So going back to what we noticed in the graphs when we were just examining them before we'd even seen questions. Temperature dictates beetle survival due to their survival niche, suggesting warmer temperatures are the preferred climate for beetles. And I see, yeah. It's the only response I have so far. It's a good one. So beetles tend to survive more in warmer temperatures. So we're seeing an association here that when temperatures increase, we also see, actually, I want to make sure that I notice these years don't completely line up. If I'm looking at an increase in, say, 2005, between 2005 and 2010, that's when I see a big increase in my beetle population. Okay, so that's a good relationship to notice there. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about integrated pest management. So what is integrated pest management, or IPM? Anything you can remember about it? You could talk about it generally, or if you want to tell me about some techniques, that's great too. What's the idea behind integrated pest management? I'm not seeing much in the chat. One thing maybe to consider is how it's different than maybe conventional agriculture has been over the last, 50 years or so. Yes, agreed. Take a guess. This is the best way for us to learn, is just by guessing and thinking about it a little bit. Pesticide can certainly be a part of it, but it can be a different way to manage. It's not going to rely solely on pesticides. Gotcha, Zoe. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about it. It could be GMOs. Yeah. So examples, well, actually, let me back up for just a minute before we get to our examples. So we think about crops and pests as an ecological system. And so we definitely have to know a little bit about the ecology of the area. And we're going to use a combination of chemical approaches. So there may be pesticides involved, but we're also going to think about our cultivation. We're going to think about biological controls for the pests. And so our goal is to reduce the pest populations to an economically tolerable level. And hopefully you're taking notes on this. Think about the goal with IPM is not to eliminate all pests. We aren't trying to sterilize our field. We just want to reduce the pest population so that if we're growing crops or we're growing timber, we're still making a profit, but it's not necessarily completely eliminating the pest population. We want to think about it from an ecological perspective. Pesticides are often used, but it's not our first thing. Last resort maybe sounds a little bit dramatic. It's just not going to be the first thing that we choose. We're going to look at things on from a perspective of holistic sort of ecological views. Okay. Maskia said she couldn't hear anything, or he. I apologize. I'm not sure what that might be what might be happening there. Is the sound okay for everybody else? Okay. It may be an adjustment on your device is necessary. Okay. Some examples of integrated pest management. There are a lot out there. And so for those of you that haven't covered this unit, I'll just go over a few brief examples, but you can fool the pest. So we know that that monocropping is not very ecologically sound or sustainable for many reasons. One of the reasons is because you really increase the number of pests on that crop. So if we have fields and fields, hundreds or thousands of acres of corn, then that's really encouraging any corn pests to come to that area. So if we rotate crops, so maybe we grow corn in one season and we do soybeans in another, or we alternate our crops, like with some strip cropping, just so that we've got multiple different crops in an area, then you don't have one pest that takes over. Providing homes for pest enemies. So I'm just going to give you an opportunity to post in chat. Do you know of anything that eats pests? And you might think, many of our pests are insects. Not all of them, of course. There's fungi and there's other organisms that affects our crops or timber or other things that we're trying to grow. But what's a pest enemy that you know of? Snakes? Yes. And Kaylee, that's one of the reasons why when I hear, or maybe on social media, see people posting about I hate snakes, I usually say, do you like rats and mice more? Because they're a good biological control. Hawks, bats, Olivia, I love bats too, for a similar reason. The more bats we have, the fewer mosquitoes we have. So that's exactly the kind of thinking. So pest enemies, it might be as simple as having a shelter belt of trees around your field, and that's going to encourage bird populations, perhaps some bat populations too. Frogs might be potentially. It depends on the species, Zoe. So it depends on what organism you're trying to control, and those are the pest enemies that you're gonna want to provide. But often just having a naturalized system, like I talked about, a trees or a riparian zone, if you're talking about around a stream, those can be areas where things that eat pests can find a home. Bring in natural enemies. So oftentimes ladybugs are brought in to deal with aphid infestations. There's your GMOs. I think Tyrone mentioned GMOs. They implant genetic resistance. You can use insect perfumes to maybe trap them. So I don't know if you've ever seen, there are bags for us to trap emerald ash borers, and they have a pheromone in there that attracts the ash borer. It's a type of beetle into the, I think it's a type of beetle, into the bag, and it can't get out. So yeah, Biggest Little Farm. Oh, it's a great documentary. And then hormones might prevent the species from getting into its stage where it becomes a pest. And we can also scald them. Oh yeah, owl boxes, hawk boxes, that's sort of hard to say, to get rid of gophers. Those are all great, great examples. Okay, scald them is great for ants. It sounds harsh, but it does, we are trying to get things that will target the species and not just blanketly apply pesticides that may remain in the environment for long periods of time, or affect species that we don't want to target. Okay, some advantages of IPM. So a good IPM program can save money. So it can also obviously increase food quality, and it can not, you're allowing some pests there, but it doesn't really reduce crop yields if you do a cost ratio analysis. It can reduce inputs of fertilizer and irrigation. The biggest problem with applying pesticides is that third bullet about genetic resistance. So we know when we apply pesticides, we reduce the pest population, but sometimes just temporarily, because you're encouraging resistance in that community. And when the pests return, they can return in droves, and that can cause the pesticide treadmill where you're just increasing your application again and again to try and just get pests to a tolerable level. And then obviously, if we aren't applying pesticide, we don't have runoff. So it's going to reduce our pollution and reduce the risk to wildlife and to us humans. There are a few disadvantages. You really have to know the ecology of the situation. And I don't know if you guys have ever read The Omnivore's Dilemma, but there is a character in there, Joel Salatin, that runs Polyface Farm. Yeah, it's a good book. And he talks about just understanding where you live and understanding how the ecology, the whole system works together. And that can help you to figure out what is the right pest for the job. It usually is going to be slower than conventional pesticides. So if I'm trying to get rid of aphids and I'm releasing ladybugs in my field, it's going to take a little bit of time for them to get control of that aphid population. And then knowing one area and developing methods for a crop in one area doesn't necessarily apply to all areas. So again, knowing being an expert in the ecology of where you are is pretty important. And initially the costs will be higher, but like many environmental things, replacing light bulbs, the cost comes on the front end, and then it can result in lower costs on the back end, like fewer, lower costs of pesticide use. Yeah, so those are some of the disadvantages to keep in mind with. Okay, let's take a look at an example multiple choice question on pest control methods. So biological control methods for managing insect pests are effective for reasons that include all of the following. Roman numeral 1 is they promote genetic resistance in target species, resulting in a population explosion of that target. They generally focus on one target insect to ensure that the target insect population remains low, and they can lead to a self-perpetuating population of control species. So take a minute to read through those, and if you'll throw in chat which letter you think is correct. Guesses are welcome. All right, I see B, I see D. Yeah, so D is the best answer. So those of you that answered B, you're correct. It is 2, but it's also 3. So number 1 is, or I, Roman numeral I, is not correct because it's an advantage that they don't promote genetic resistance. It's not an issue. Okay. Let's try another one. Biological controls are frequently used to replace persistent chemical pesticides. Which of the following represents the greatest potential risk of using biological controls? And A, the control agent attacks not only its intended target, but also beneficial species. B, the control agent mutates and is no longer an effective control agent. C, repeated applications or introductions are required to eliminate the pest population. D, residual pesticides in the environment kill the control agent before it can eradicate the pest. And E, biological controls prove to be more costly to use than chemical pesticides. And notice it asks for the greatest potential risk. I see some A's, I see an E. Yeah, so A is the best answer. It is true that they might be expensive on the front end, but if you calculate, over time and your yields, then they aren't necessarily more costly than chemical pesticides. So the best answer is A. With biological controls, one of the risks we worry about is it might attack other beneficial species. And maybe you guys have seen cane toads, and so you kind of know what I'm thinking about when I refer to that. All right, next, let's talk about an FRQ that's related to integrated pest management. So methods to protect forests from pathogens and insects include using IPM. What is one method? So you might refer to your notes that we just went through. What is one method that you can use with IPM to control pests? And this is where you can make me feel good because you remember a couple of the methods. Even just one of the methods would be great. Bring in natural enemies that are also native to the area. Good. And I like that you put that are also native to the area. So we're not bringing in species that can get out of control like our cane toad friend. Any others? So that's definitely one of them. That would be a good biocontrol. And you might think about the issues with monocropping. All right, I'll go ahead and share some answers. So biocontrol or natural predators, you might change the crop that you're growing there. So you do some crop rotation or some intercropping, like I mentioned earlier. And then limited chemical application. Remember that IPM can still, include use of pesticides as part of it. Okay. This FRQ goes on to say integrated pest management can be used in sustainable forest management to control pests rather than removing affected trees. Okay. Justify the use of integrated pest management as an alternative to removing affected trees by explaining an advantage of IPM in forests other than pest control. So how is IPM advantageous besides the fact that it controls pests? What are the other benefits to IPM? Right, go back to that list of advantages that we talked about. And you might also consider just the fact if we leave the trees there, what advantage does that have? And that's it, Zoe. So we're going to maintain some habitat and some biodiversity if we leave the trees in place. Okay, so that's definitely the top of our list. Other options, let me back up just a minute. It decreases the cost of pest management. So we're not spending as much money on chemical pesticides. And that may mean that it's cheaper for consumers. And then the genetic diversity issue, we can support a lot of different species if we leave some trees in place. So remember, Unit 5 also has clear cutting and selective cutting as part of its topics. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this question, because it addresses both those areas. Okay, other topics in Unit 5. Farmers need to make many decisions about how they grow their crops. One of these decisions is whether or not to use synthetic fertilizer or organic fertilizer like manure. So what is an advantage of using synthetic fertilizer instead of organic fertilizer? Which one of those is an advantage of using synthetic fertilizer instead of organic fertilizer? through these. So A is synthetic fertilizer can provide more targeted macronutrients to the crops. B, synthetic fertilizer remains in the soil longer than organic fertilizer does, reducing the volume needed and therefore the cost to the farmer. Synthetic fertilizer adds to soil texture and increases the soil's water holding capacity. Or D, organic fertilizer runs off more readily into waterways, leading to nutrient overload. I see some choice A's in there. And yes, absolutely. So you want to make sure that you, if you're highlighting or underlining in your test, you're thinking, okay, I've got to come up with an advantage, and that is an advantage. B and C, by the way, they're just not true. Synthetic fertilizer does not increase water holding capacity. Remember, organic fertilizer is things like mulch. Synthetic fertilizer is going to be like Miracle-Gro, something we spray or sprinkle on. And it doesn't necessarily remain in the soil longer either, because we know that stuff like Miracle-Gro or things you spray on the crops, other than compost or mulch, those tend to be washed away during runoff. So synthetic fertilizer is not going to be there as it washes away. And so D is true, but that's a disadvantage of synthetic fertilizer. Okay, nice job, guys. Let's take a look at another one. Which of the following best describes an environmental advantage of urbanization? Again, this is another topic from Unit 5. Individuals living in cities have more varied employment opportunities than individuals living in rural areas. Individuals living in cities have greater access to health care than individuals living in rural areas. C is individuals living in cities usually have greater access to fresh local agricultural products than those in rural areas. And then finally, D, individuals living in cities usually have a lower transportation carbon footprint than individuals living in rural areas. What is our advantage? And I see pretty unanimously voting for D, and that is true. D is the best answer. And again, make sure that you're underlining words like environmental advantage. Even though you could make an argument for some of these, the environmental advantage, the only one that really refers to environmental advantage, is the lower carbon footprint.
Can I just jump in here real quick and say something? And guys, this is just another example to show you how that human population element shows up in so many of those units. And so this is another example here. So
yes,
tying that in.
And there's just lots of overlap in general, I think, with units. Okay, here's another multiple choice question. This is about aquaculture, which is topic in Unit 5. What is a direct economic advantage associated with aquaculture? A direct economic advantage. So economics in this question. Aquaculture breeds genetically modified fish to increase the amount of biodiversity in a population. Aquaculture reduces the number of fishing operations in an area. Aquaculture produces large amounts of seafood for human purchase and consumption year-round. Aquaculture requires large bodies of water for its operation. See lots of C's pouring into the chat room. Yeah, so a lot of the questions associated with our content, they're going to want you to know what advantages and disadvantages are to various I don't know, situations or methods of growing food in this case. So C is the best answer. Aquaculture produces large amounts of seafoods for human purchase and consumption year round. So that's an economic advantage. A would be incorrect because genetically modified fish mating with wild caught fish are actually one of the concerns about aquaculture. If we're using genetically modified fish, that would be a disadvantage, and it's a decrease in biodiversity there. B is not necessarily true. Aquaculture and fishing operations aren't necessarily in competition, and D isn't really a direct economic advantage. Okay, clear cutting, as I mentioned before, is one of the topics in this unit. And so here, this is an FRQ based on clear cutting. Forests are a natural resource found in Canada. Spruce, fir, and pine species are native over much of the country and are harvested to produce a variety of products. One method of harvest is clear cutting. And so you want to kind of get in your head what clear cutting means. What's one, which this is describe one unintended consequence of clear cutting forests. And it's specific to Canada, but you're probably going to come up with lots of things that apply to forests in general. What's one unintended consequence of clear cutting? Release of carbon, nutrient deficiency in the soil because you have an increase in erosion. Nice. Yeah, so first you want to make sure you understand clear cutting is where we're going to remove the whole swath of trees. We're not, selectively cutting just certain numbers. We're going to reduce the whole swath. And then you want to ask yourself, what are the advantages of trees? So yes, disruption to soil, good. So clear cutting is going to reduce habitat. And that means that we're going to have biodiversity loss because organisms that rely on those trees for shelter and food no longer have them. And then you guys chimed in about carbon dioxide. Trees are a great carbon sink. They're not going to be there anymore to take up the carbon. And actually, we know that as trees decay, they're going to increase carbon dioxide levels that are there. So, and that's going to affect climate change. I would encourage you whenever you talk about carbon dioxide to also describe the effect, to link it with climate change, because sometimes the questions require that in order for you to earn credit. Soil erosion increases. And I like that Zoe connected that with nutrient deficiency because that's also important to do. So when the trees are no longer there to hold the soil in place, we're going to have a loss of nutrients. Or you could have said an increase in sedimentation, or it's going to decrease fishery or impact fisheries negatively. It's always good to make those associations for response questions. Stream temperature, soil temperature can increase, so we don't have as much shading in that area where we remove trees. If it's along a stream, we don't have as much shade along the stream. And we know that trees, give us that important temperature regulation. And then finally, another option is about the economic costs of flooding downstream. So trees, can help take in water and hold it temporarily when we have a big rain event. And now we're not going to have that. So we'll definitely have an increase of erosion, but we're also going to have more flooding downstream. Okay. There are a variety of methods to create sustainable forests, and each has their own unique advantages and disadvantages. Explain how the removal of a few trees could be used to create or manage sustainable forests in Canada. So how could the removal of a few trees create or manage sustainable forests in Canada? You do want to think about, this is alluding to selective cutting, so feel free to use that in your response, but think about the advantages of selective cutting. And you could also relate that maybe to some of the disadvantages of clear cutting. So removing a few trees allows other trees to grow. And so you can have new species of trees that take up that space. Okay, so it could create a little biodiversity by letting those other trees fill that in. Younger sprouts and trees to dominate instead of older near-death trees. Okay, more productive, sustainable forest. Any others? Those are both good responses. Okay, let's take a look at possible answers. So you could have said we're maintaining habitat for wildlife. If we're leaving most of the trees there and just selectively cutting a few, then we are not removing the habitat like we did the clear cutting. You guys hit on the third bullet there. With small sections of trees removed, we open areas and increase available sunlight and nutrients. We can also, prevent disease or invasive species because they can't pass from tree to tree. So that's another good one. And then the last one, not all the trees are removed at one time, so timber can be harvested over time, and we'll have mature trees in the forest and a steady timber crop. So they didn't necessarily ask us to pick an economic advantage or an environmental advantage, so you could include both in this response. Again, I think it's great when you're taking a test on paper, just to highlight or underline these parts and pieces, if it needs to be economic or environmental, or if it doesn't have to be either one. Okay, graphs are important. So here's another graph. Take a minute to analyze this. Average per capita ecological footprint of major Canadian cities from 2010 to 2015. And so take a look at this legend over here: services, goods, personal transportation, housing, and food. Do you notice any differences between those cities and their ecological footprint? Always good to look at before you get your question. So are there any that have really, lower or larger blocks in there for service, goods, personal transportation, housing, or food compared to others? And you can even look at which ones have the largest ecological footprint. Or which ones have the smallest ecological footprint. Okay, I'm not seeing much activity in the chat. Let me give you a question and that might kind of spur your thinking a little bit. So again, using this graph, it's a multiple choice question. The cities of Edmonton and Calgary are relatively far north and at high elevation. Which of the following best explains the data presented in their ecological footprints? Is it A, many of the inhabitants of Edmonton and Calgary must commute to southern cities for work? Is it B, products must be shipped large distances from major shipping ports to Edmonton and Calgary? Is it C, growing seasons are shorter in Edmonton and Calgary, requiring larger amounts of fertilizers to grow crops? Or is it D, colder average temperatures and longer nights in Edmonton and Calgary lead to high energy usage to heat and light homes? So which one do you think it is? A, B, C, or D? Okay, I see some A options. So the answer might surprise you a little bit. The best answer is D. So the primary difference in the footprints of these cities is related to their housing. Notice that there is a lot of personal transportation for Calgary and Edmonton, but maybe not that much bigger than, Charlottetown or Halifax. The biggest difference with them being far north is the colder temperatures and the longer nights. Any questions about that one? Okay. So don't be thrown off by, you don't have to know a lot about Canada because they'll give you, or whatever region they're talking about, they'll give you the information you need to be able to answer that question. So that can be an important thing to remember too. Okay, here's another multiple choice question for you. Yeah, it's possible that we didn't necessarily notice all the choices because they do, have some distractors in there that seem like they could be correct. Okay, This is another topic in the unit. Which of the following best explains why the maximum sustainable yield for ocean fisheries has been exceeded? And so maximum sustainable yield is, a vocabulary word you want to know. And I can fill that in for you if you're not comfortable with it, unless somebody in the chat wants to jump in. Maximum sustainable yield. The name is very much what it means. Okay, I've got some folks jumping in, and the answer is yeah. So you probably know what maximum sustainable yield is. So this is what we can harvest long term from a fishery, right? Our maximum sustainable yield. Sorry, I've got some sirens outside in downtown Lexington. A is the populations of fish-eating birds, such as albatross, have increased. B is too many fish of reproductive age are harvested. C, too many marine fish farms have been created. D is everything is trapped by large bottom trawl nets and used for food. And E is for every calorie of fish caught, a ship uses only about 0.5 calorie of fuel energy. E probably looked pretty wrong to you from the beginning because we know that's not true. And many of you answered B, the best answer there. Too many fish of reproductive age are harvested. And that's kind of the goal of maximum sustainable yield, is that we, leave those fish of reproductive age so that it's going to be sustainable for them to, continue to have offspring that can grow up and then be harvested for food. Nicely done. Another topic, another multiple choice question. A sustainable society would emphasize A, so thinking about sustainable here, sustainable society, A, maintaining the current rates of energy flow and resource use. B, converting the world's high quality energy resources to low quality heat. C, recycling both matter and high quality energy. D, using energy efficiently and reusing and recycling matter. And E, quickly expanding nuclear power because it is a renewable resource. And this is a good opportunity for you not only to think about which answer is correct, very important, but since we're reviewing, let's think about why some of the other answers are not correct. All right, I'm seeing lots of D choices in there. D is the correct answer. A is not the correct answer because I don't think that any of us really feel like we're living sustainably. So we know that we need to change what we're doing. There's a lot of evidence like rising CO2 levels and all the consequences that come in with climate change that are indicating that. B is not correct because that's already a problem. One way that we can, reduce our ecological footprint and our carbon dioxide output is getting better at converting high quality energy into something more usable. Heat is usually considered low quality and can't be used in a lot of ways. So if you think about your conventional car, the hood of the car gets really warm, and that might be great in the winter to funnel some of that in, but oftentimes that conversion to heat is not helpful, nor is the friction of your tires on the road helpful to letting you use that gasoline efficiently. Why isn't C a correct option? Recycling both matter and high quality energy. Why is that not correct? You can either post it in chat, or if you want to jump in and speak on your mic, feel free. Why isn't C a good option? Recycling seems good.
Because in the long run, recycling the high quality energy generally leads to stuff like nuclear. So in that high quality energy, it's impractical to try to recycle it because its half-life is so long that it would be difficult to in the first place.
Okay, and recycling matter is awesome, but energy recycling is not actually something we can do. We can't reuse energy, and I think you might be thinking about nuclear power and reusing some of the waste products, but just strictly recycling energy. Energy is a one-way flow, But you guys, I think, had realized that to some extent since you picked D. Is nuclear power renewable? Speaking of nuclear power, in letter E, is nuclear power renewable? It is not. Thank you, Tyrone. It is not. So we know that it doesn't emit carbon dioxide, but it's not necessarily, a renewable resource. Yes, laws of thermodynamics. Thank you, Ms. Nolen. That's absolutely true. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. When we think about how many times we've been on meets and done virtual learning, I know it's pretty impressive that you guys have been here with us today. There is a recording of today's meet at bit.ly, Advanced Kentucky, or Advent KY. And we hope that you'll join us for the next content review session on March 13th. There are some ways that you can contact me or Ms. Nolen if you need to, and I can put that slide up again as well. But we really appreciate you joining us today. It has been a pleasure talking to you all. Thanks. Have a good Saturday. Take Ms. Nolen's advice and go outside.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
You're welcome. See you all.